Before the state of Colorado had public defenders, they had a system of court-appointed attorneys. And younger attorneys would get the appointment, but older attorneys were charged with working with them and sort of mentoring them. And they essentially volunteered for free. So there was a fee for court-appointed attorneys and none for the more experienced attorneys. One of my clients back then happened to be a former district attorney of Boulder County, and his partner was also a client of mine. But they had a young lawyer working for them who got appointed on a case. It was a drug possession case. And we went to a suppression hearing, and the police officer that made the arrest got on the stand and testified to the circumstances surrounding the arrest and the probable cause for making the arrest and searching the defendant and seizing the evidence. It was a pretty straightforward case. The police detectives and police officers back then were fairly upfront, fairly honorable, fairly straight, and they weren't on a real zealous crusade to dunk all the witches and marijuana smokers because they had a mission from God, like happened later. This was prior to the Nixon administration, by the way. Anyway, the policeman testifies, and it was exactly what our client related to us, which was the problem. So the judge, after the officer testified and the prosecution asked this young lawyer, I said, "Mr. Smith, do you have any questions?" And the lawyer stood there dumbfounded. The judge says, "Mr. Smith, do you have any questions?" And the young lawyer looked over at me, and I shook my head no. And he said, "It's your witness, Mr. Smith. What do you want to do now?" And out of the mouths of Babe came this comment. He looks at the judge and he says, "Your Honor, the policeman told the truth, and I don't know what to do next." The judge looked at me and said, "Well, what do you want to do, Mr. Blewett?" And I said, "Well, we moved to dismiss. The evidence is clear. It was an illegal search," which was true. But it reflected an attitude at that time of younger lawyers and started a trend which became greatly exaggerated as the drug war took hold. This was before the war on drugs occurred. There was a bit of a drug problem now and then, mostly as college students with marijuana, like this case. But after that, this zealousness took hold of the police, and they went on a crusade, sort of like during the witch hunt days. They were taught marijuana was bad and marijuana is going to kill everyone. And marijuana possession is the first step to heroin addiction, and heroin addicts, the women turn into hookers and prostitutes, etc. And it's bad for the society. And it was the greater good to trample the vineyard of states' rights and constitutional rights to eradicate the bad crop of drug addiction and drug use. Well, the Vietnam War was heating up and getting more and more contentious, and most of the politicians, police officers, detectives, etc., saw a high correlation between long hair and drug use, and drug use and anti-war sentiment and anti-war protest. So the drug war started out primarily as a statement of right-leaning Americans and scared World War II vets that they were losing the propaganda war, and frustration on administration that they couldn't sell an undeclared war, or as some put it, an illegal war, to the American youth. They were resisting the draft. They were protesting against the war. They were very vocal against the war, and that frustrated the power elite because they were brought up that you defend your country and you don't question authority, and it's your country, right or wrong, it's your country. So you had some interesting alliances starting to appear. You had bikers showing up at anti-war rallies, carrying American flags and getting into the protest marchers and foiling them and beating on them. You had police beating up the protesters, the use of tear gas, things like that. The demonstrations against the war were much rougher than what I'd experienced during the civil rights days. I remember marching with Martin Luther King and feeling the hostility of the crowd, but never felt threatened as far as my safety or anything else was concerned. However, that changed with the Vietnam protests. You had a feeling of potential harm from the anti-protest people, the ultra-conservatives, the conservative right, the police department, things like this. At that time, I also saw a politicalization of the American flag. Protesters would hang the flag upside down, which was an international symbol of distress. It became famous. It became famous during the movie The Man Who Knew Too Much with Doris Day, and I think Jimmy Stewart, I can't remember now. But they flew an American flag upside down from an embassy, which showed distress that one of the children of the heroes was locked up in the embassy because the guy knew too much about a potential assassination, and he didn't know that he knew too much. Anyway, I'm getting off the subject here. The flag became a symbol of patriotism, whether misguided or not. So you started having flag cases, flag burning prosecutions, things like this. Well, at that time, police officers then started wearing American flags on their uniforms to show cohesiveness in the law and order faction, show support for the war no matter what, and support for law and order. So it was a very, very interesting times. I know one of the first cases I had was a fellow who had worn a flag as a patch over the rear end of his blue jeans. And they got arrested. He got prosecuted for that. I tried the case, and my law partner at that time, John Bisbee, took the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and won it as a First Amendment based case. That sort of started our whole focus of practice on constitutional law, particularly First, Second, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments. One of the things I did during that era was draft regulations for the Larimer County Probation Department of allowing probationers and convicted felons on parole carry weapons, hunting rifles, during the hunting season, because it was sort of a recognized thing in Larimer County that this was an accepted moray, accepted folkway, and the judges didn't want to restrict firearm use for hunting, because everybody knew the reason for the firearm registration laws and the possession laws was to prohibit criminals. And criminals didn't mean various drug violators and things such as that. And also, once somebody had done his time, he shouldn't be punished for the rest of his life for having done that crime. So if somebody made it through a prison sentence, he was deemed to have paid his debt to society and was then allowed to have his civil rights back. That changed when we went from a common law system to a Napoleonic system, because under the Napoleonic system, once a criminal, always a criminal. And one never paid his debt to society because he was just a bad person. So it was a bad person being labeled rather than somebody who had done a bad act, which we'll have more on later. But anyway, that's the beginning of a lot of this. Thank you for listening, and hope you enjoyed.